Elizabeth, a young black pregnant woman, was declared dead under mysterious circumstances, but what happened next shocked everyone. You won't believe the betrayal and resilience in this story. Watch until the end to uncover the full truth. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories. Elizabeth adjusted her oversized coat as she walked through the narrow hallway of her family's grand estate. The house, once bustling with warmth and laughter, now stood quiet, echoing only faint memories of better days. Born into wealth and privilege, Elizabeth's life had always seemed enviable to outsiders. Her father, a celebrated philanthropist and businessman, had built an empire that extended far beyond their small community, while her mother, a renowned surgeon, had earned the admiration of countless lives she had saved. Yet, behind the facade of perfection, Elizabeth had endured more loss than most could imagine. Her mother's battle with cancer had been long and arduous. Elizabeth, still a teenager at the time, had clung to the hope that her mother's strength would prevail. But it hadn't. When her mother passed, the once unshakable bond within the family began to unravel. Her father, though loving, found solace in his work and his growing collection of historical artifacts, retreating emotionally from the only child he had left. By the time she was 20, Elizabeth had essentially been left to navigate life alone. Years later, her father's sudden death sealed her solitude. Now, the family estate was hers, a vast, hollow mansion filled with relics of the past and memories that felt more like ghosts. It was there that Elizabeth first met Maria, the woman who would become her stepmother. Maria entered her life abruptly, bringing with her a young daughter, Victoria, who was just a few years Elizabeth's junior. Maria was a complex figure, charming, warm, and eager to integrate herself into Elizabeth's life. At first, Elizabeth appreciated Maria's presence. It seemed as though Maria truly wanted to help her heal and rebuild. Victoria, too, showed genuine care, treating Elizabeth like an older sister. The bond between the two grew quickly, and Victoria became the closest thing to family Elizabeth had. Slowly, she began to trust them, finding comfort in their support. Years passed, and Elizabeth's life took a positive turn. She met Daniel, a kind and ambitious man who brought her hope for the future. Their love blossomed quickly, and soon they were married. The news of her pregnancy only added to her joy. It felt like life was giving her a second chance, a chance to create the family she had lost. Victoria was ecstatic for her, insisting she move back into the family home during her pregnancy. Maria, ever the supportive stepmother, agreed wholeheartedly. For a time, everything seemed perfect. Elizabeth and Daniel began planning for their child's future, filling the nursery with soft pastels and tiny clothes. Victoria was a constant presence, helping Elizabeth with every detail from baby names to prenatal care. Maria, though less involved, maintained her role as the caring matriarch. Then, one crisp autumn morning, everything changed. Victoria was the first to find her. Elizabeth had not come down for breakfast, and her absence felt unusual. When Victoria knocked on her bedroom door and received no answer, she entered to find Elizabeth motionless on the floor. Panic surged through her as she called for an ambulance, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. At the hospital, doctors scrambled to determine what had happened. Despite extensive tests, they couldn't find a clear cause of death. There was no sign of trauma, no evidence of foul play, just an eerie silence surrounding Elizabeth's lifeless body. Victoria, devastated, refused to accept the idea of an autopsy. She argued that Elizabeth deserved peace, and that cutting into her body would only bring more pain to the family. Maria supported Victoria's decision, her demeanor calm and measured. "We need to let her rest," Maria said softly, placing a comforting hand on Victoria's shoulder. "She wouldn't want this." The days that followed were a blur of grief and arrangements. The funeral was planned with meticulous care, every detail honoring Elizabeth's memory. But beneath the surface of mourning lay an undercurrent of unease. Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Her instincts whispered that there was more to Elizabeth's death than anyone was willing to admit. When the scientists approached Victoria with their unconventional idea, she hesitated. The proposal was unorthodox and unsettling. They wanted to place a small, discreet camera inside Elizabeth's coffin to monitor for any unusual activity. The goal, they explained, was purely scientific, to gather data that might help explain the mystery of her death. After much deliberation, Victoria agreed. "If it might help us understand what happened to her, then I'll allow it," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The scientists assured her that the process would be discreet and respectful, and that the footage would be used solely for research purposes. The day of the funeral arrived, heavy with somber clouds. Friends and family gathered to pay their respects, unaware of the camera hidden within the ornate coffin. Victoria stood by Maria's side, her face pale but composed as the final prayers were said. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, she whispered a silent promise to Elizabeth. "I'll find out the truth. I owe you that." Later that evening, as Victoria sat alone in her room, she couldn't shake the sense of anticipation. The scientists had promised to inform her of any findings as soon as they reviewed the footage. For now, all she could do was wait. Meanwhile, in a secluded lab, the scientists prepared to activate the camera feed. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and skepticism as they adjusted the equipment. They didn't truly expect to find anything extraordinary, but the mystery surrounding Elizabeth's death made even the smallest possibility worth exploring. As the feed went live, the room fell silent. For the first few hours, the footage showed nothing unusual, just the stillness of the coffin and the faint hum of the recording device. But as the night deepened, something unexpected happened. The image on the screen flickered, and the faintest movement caught their attention. One of the scientists leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Did you see that?" he whispered to his colleague. The others gathered around, their breaths held as the movement became more pronounced. What they saw next would change everything. The lab was plunged into stunned silence. Every scientist in the room was glued to the monitor, their faces pale as the figure on the screen stirred. At first, the movement was subtle, a faint twitch of the hand, a slow turn of the head. Then it became undeniable. Elizabeth was moving. Dr. Simmons, the lead researcher, broke the silence. "Is this real? This can't be real?" His voice was shaky, disbelief clear in his tone. He rewound the footage and played it again, but the images didn't change. There she was, lying in the coffin, her fingers curling weakly as though fighting against invisible restraints. "We have to act now," Simmons said, snapping out of his shock. "She's alive." The lab erupted into chaos. Phones were grabbed, calls made, as the team scrambled to contact the authorities. A sense of urgency gripped the room as Simmons ordered them to continue monitoring the feed while he reached out to local police and emergency services. Meanwhile, back at the family estate, Victoria sat in the dimly lit living room, her thoughts a tangled web of grief and doubt. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the warmth did little to soothe her unease. The house felt emptier than ever, its silence a constant reminder of Elizabeth's absence. She hadn't yet heard from the scientists, and every passing moment only heightened her anxiety. When the phone rang, Victoria nearly jumped out of her seat. She lunged for it, her hand trembling as she brought it to her ear. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Victoria," came Dr. Simmons' hurried voice. "We need to act immediately. We have reason to believe that Elizabeth is alive." Victoria froze. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. "What did you say?" she asked, her heart pounding. "We don't have time to explain everything," Simmons continued, "but you need to trust me. We've already called the police and emergency services. They're on their way to retrieve her." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. "Alive? Are you certain?" "We're certain," he said. "We've been watching her movements. She's conscious, but she's trapped. We need to get her out of there before it's too late." Victoria felt her knees go weak, and she sank into the nearest chair. The weight of Simmons' words crashed over her, flooding her with equal parts hope and terror. "I'll meet you at the cemetery," she said, her voice firm despite the chaos swirling inside her. The drive to the cemetery felt interminable. Victoria's mind raced with questions. If Elizabeth was alive, how had this happened? What had caused her apparent death? And why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? And, most pressing of all, who could have been responsible? When she arrived, the scene was already chaotic. Police cars surrounded the gravesite, their lights casting eerie red and blue shadows across the rows of headstones. A group of officers was gathered near Elizabeth's freshly dug grave, their voices low but tense. Victoria pushed her way through the crowd. "I'm her sister," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "What's happening?" An officer gestured toward the gravesite. "We're working on extracting the coffin now. Emergency responders are on standby." As they worked, Victoria noticed something unusual. Maria was there, standing at the edge of the crowd. Her stepmother's expression was unreadable, but there was a stiffness to her posture that set off alarm bells in Victoria's mind. Why was Maria here? She hadn't mentioned coming to the cemetery earlier. Before Victoria could confront her, the sound of the coffin being lifted out of the ground drew everyone's attention. The team of responders worked quickly, carefully prying open the lid. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they saw Elizabeth inside, her chest rising and falling faintly with each shallow breath. "She's breathing," one of the responders shouted. "Get the stretcher ready." The sight of her sister alive brought tears to Victoria's eyes, but her relief was short-lived. As Elizabeth was lifted from the coffin, her eyes fluttered open, and she let out a weak, panicked cry. "Elizabeth! It's okay!" Victoria called, rushing to her side. "You're safe now." Elizabeth's gaze darted around wildly, her fear palpable. "What happened?" she rasped. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. Before anyone could answer, one of the officers approached Victoria. "Miss," he said, his expression grave, "we need to talk. There's reason to believe your stepmother may be involved in this." Victoria's head snapped toward Maria, who was now being escorted away by two officers. "What are you talking about?" Victoria demanded, following them. The officer hesitated before continuing. During her initial questioning, she made statements suggesting she knew Elizabeth wasn't dead. We also found traces of a sedative in the glass Elizabeth drank from the night before her death. Your stepmother has been taken into custody for further questioning. Victoria's mind reeled. Could it be true? Had Maria, the woman who had supported her through so much, really been capable of such betrayal? The pieces began to fall into place. The calm way Maria had handled Elizabeth's death, her insistence on refusing an autopsy, her sudden appearance at the cemetery. It all pointed to a horrifying possibility. As the ambulance carrying Elizabeth sped away, Victoria stood frozen in place. Anger and disbelief boiled within her as she watched Maria being led toward a police car. Maria's expression was eerily calm, but as their eyes met, a flicker of something, remorse, fear, crossed her face. "Why?" Victoria whispered, though Maria was too far away to hear her. She turned back to the grave, now empty, and felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Elizabeth was alive, but the nightmare was far from over. Elizabeth lay motionless in the hospital bed, her breaths shallow but steady. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the room as machines beeped softly, monitoring her fragile state. Despite the chaos of the past few hours, the sight of her sister alive gave Victoria a glimmer of hope she hadn't dared to feel since Elizabeth's death. Yet that hope was tangled with an inescapable anger and betrayal. Maria's arrest and subsequent confession had opened a wound that no apology could ever fully heal. Victoria sat by Elizabeth's side, her hand clasping her sister's limp one. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on her chest. The doctor's earlier words echoed in her mind. Elizabeth's survival was nothing short of a miracle. The sedative Maria had slipped into her drink had slowed her heart rate to such an extent that it mimicked death. If not for the camera, Elizabeth would have been buried alive, her fate sealed beneath the earth. A soft knock at the door pulled Victoria from her thoughts. A detective entered, his face somber. "Miss Victoria, I wanted to update you on the situation." Victoria stood, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "What's happening with Maria?" The detective hesitated, then replied, "She confessed to administering the sedative. According to her, she intended to incapacitate Elizabeth, not this." His words faltered as if even he couldn't believe what he was saying. "Maria claims it was part of a larger plan to take control of the estate. She saw Elizabeth's growing independence as a threat." Victoria's hands clenched into fists. "And she thought the solution was to make her disappear?" The detective nodded grimly. "She insists she didn't intend for things to go this far, but given the evidence and her confession, she's facing serious charges, including attempted murder." Victoria's stomach churned. Maria, the woman she had trusted like a second mother, had betrayed their family in the cruelest way imaginable. But there was no time to dwell on Maria's treachery. Elizabeth needed her now more than ever. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. The detective nodded and left, leaving her alone once more with her sister. Elizabeth stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Vicky?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," Victoria said, rushing to her side. Tears welled in her eyes as she gently stroked Elizabeth's hand. "You're safe now." Elizabeth's gaze wandered the room, confusion clouding her expression. "What happened?" "The last thing I remember was drinking tea with Maria." Victoria swallowed hard, unsure how much to reveal. "It's a long story," she said gently. "Right now you just need to rest. We'll talk when you're stronger." Elizabeth nodded weakly, her eyelids growing heavy. Within moments, she was asleep again, her breathing steady and rhythmic. As the days passed, Elizabeth's strength gradually returned. The medical team was optimistic about her recovery, though the trauma of her ordeal left scars that went far deeper than her physical health. Victoria stayed by her side through every step, determined to make up for the trust she had placed in Mariah. When Elizabeth was finally strong enough to hear the truth, Victoria sat beside her bed, her hands trembling. "There's something you need to know," she began. Elizabeth's brow furrowed as she listened to her sister recount everything. Maria's betrayal, the camera, the shocking footage of her movements in the coffin, and the confession that had exposed Maria's sinister plans. By the time Victoria finished, Elizabeth's face was pale, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "She wanted me gone," Elizabeth said quietly. "She looked me in the eye every day, and all that time she wanted me gone." Victoria reached for her sister's hand. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth. I should have seen it. I should have protected you." Elizabeth shook her head. "You trusted her, just like I did. None of this is your fault." Tears slid down Victoria's cheeks. "I let her into our family. I let her hurt you." Elizabeth squeezed her hand weakly. "But you also saved me. Without you, without the camera, I wouldn't be here." Her words brought a bittersweet comfort to Victoria's heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, the sisters shared a moment of understanding, their bond stronger than the betrayal that had threatened to break them. Maria's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against her, combined with her confession, left little room for doubt. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, her actions condemned by the very community that had once respected her. For Victoria and Elizabeth, her absence was a bitter relief, a chapter of their lives they were eager to close. As Elizabeth regained her strength, she began to focus on rebuilding her life. Her experience had left her with a new perspective on the fragility of trust and the importance of resilience. With Victoria's unwavering support, she decided to channel her pain into something meaningful. "Let's start over," Elizabeth said one afternoon as she and Victoria sat together in the sunlit garden of their estate. "Not just for us, but for the people who've been hurt, like I was. We can do something good with what we've been through." Victoria smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to create a foundation," Elizabeth said firmly. "Something that helps women who've been betrayed, who've faced injustice. We can give them the support we didn't have when everything fell apart." Victoria nodded. "I'm with you. Whatever it takes, we'll make it happen." Their shared vision marked the beginning of a new chapter. Together, they turned their pain into purpose, creating a legacy that honored the strength of their bond and the resilience of their family. As they stood together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, Victoria placed a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "We've come so far," she said softly. Elizabeth smiled. "And we're just getting started." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years they felt ready to face it, together. Thank you for watching this incredible story of resilience and justice. What do you think about Elizabeth's journey and the shock and betrayal she faced? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories. See you in the next video.